Thank you very much, and especially for the invitation to all the organisers of the event. I think my presentation links up very well with Simon's, insofar as I think it's a kind of postmodern view of social theorising. So I'd ask you to bear that in mind when I talk about truth, for instance, and ideology in the following. And I am trying to link it. I'm going to illustrate a particular. I'm going to illustrate my position through reference to a particular recent critique of capitalism. So I haven't lost sight of capitalism completely. I've begun to become paperless and read from my iPad, but I've never done it standing before, so I have to see if it works out. I like to stand, but I usually have a podium or a podest. But anyway, let's try. So I have a script to stop me going on too long, and I'm going to read it. Critique of capitalism can be authoritarian, dogmatic, naive, or ideological, or indeed succumb to all four of these perils simultaneously. Such accusations are especially troubling for critical social theorising in the Frankfurt School tradition. That's the tradition from which I broadly come, or loosely come. One reason why they are particularly worrying is that the Frankfurt School tradition of social critique has its origins in the critique of capitalism, taking its inspiration in the first instance from Marx. Another reason is that Frankfurt School theorising has traditionally been guided by an anti-authoritarian impulse, coupled with a concern to avoid dogmatism and naivety, together with a commitment to ideology critique. However, as we shall see, there is a potential conflict between commitment to anti-authoritarianism on the one side and the context transcending truth claims necessary in order to avoid dogmatism, naivety, and ideology on the other. In my paper today, my thesis is that critique of capitalism must be anti-authoritarian, while at the same time maintaining the context transcending truth claims that are a prerequisite for non-dogmatic, non-naive, and non-ideological theorising. Using some Frankfurt School critiques of capitalism by way of illustration, I will begin by clarifying what I mean by authoritarian, dogmatic, naive, and ideological theorising. In a second step, I'll show why it's important to keep all four impulses, that is anti-authoritarianism, anti-dogmatism, anti-naivety, anti-ideology, why it's important to keep all four of these in productive tension, and I'm going to make a proposal as to how we should do so. I started by saying that the critique of capitalism can be authoritarian, dogmatic, naive, or ideological, or indeed all four. And of course, that's true for any kind of social critique, perhaps for any kind of theory. Authoritarian theories make assertions regarding the validity of a particular perspective or position that claim privileged access to truth, though usually they do so tacitly. To be more precise, I should say that I'm talking about epistemologically authoritarian theories. That's a bit of a mouthful, so in the following I'm just going to refer to authoritarian theorising, but I mean epistemologically authoritarian theorising. The assertions of validity made by authoritarian theories block certain kinds of counter-arguments from the outset. More precisely, they deny from the outset the relevance of certain counter-arguments for reasons that have to do with social class, gender, race, or indeed the pervasiveness of an all-encompassing ideology. Anti-authoritarian theorising, accordingly, seeks to prevent, counteract, and criticise such attempts to block putative counter-arguments. In a sense, we could say anti-authoritarian theorising democratises access to truth, which is held to be accessible in principle to everyone. Dogmatic theorising is objectionable because it's insufficiently self-reflexive and imaginative. In the case of social theory, for instance, access to truth is held to demand attentiveness to history and to actual empirical reality, together with receptiveness to new ways of interpreting the past and the present, and to imaginative projections of the future. Dogmatic theorising lacks these epistemic virtues. Put slightly differently, truth is held to be more or other than what it is claimed to be by a dogmatic theory, whose view of things may be limited, rigid, or both. Accordingly, anti-dogmatic theorizing seeks to promote attentiveness to past and present realities, openness to new perspectives on past and present, and to new ways of imagining the future. It does so in a self-reflexive manner, endeavouring to be alert to ways in which its own best efforts at attentiveness, openness, and imaginative thinking may themselves be limited and or rigid. Dogmatic theorizing has its complement in a naive attitude towards the social reality that is the object of critique. Naive theorizing is insufficiently critical of actual articulations of interests, taking these unquestioningly as a reference point for its own normative projections. Naive theorizing looks to actual expressions by social actors of needs, interests, and desires, and takes these as the benchmark for what's important in human life. It fails to see that such expressions are always mediated by language, history, culture, socio-economic context, and indeed subjective psychology, attributing a prima facie validity to such expressions, to actual expressions of interests, needs, and desires. Furthermore, naive theorizing cannot allow for the possibility that reason and affect have become petrified for whatever reason, and leaves no room for the possibility of ideologically contaminated experience. Like ideological thought forms in general, theorizing is ideological when it produces and reproduces a false or distorted consciousness. For the sake of simplicity in the following, I'm just going to talk about false consciousness, but there are variations on this. It can be just maybe distorted is sometimes a better word. But for shorthand, I'm going to say theorizing, like any ideological thought form, theorizing is ideological when it produces or reproduces a false consciousness. The consciousness is held to be false because it hinders human beings from achieving a postulated higher end to which a truth value is attributed, such as freedom, happiness, justice, or some kind of human flourishing. It's important to notice that ideology critique makes a context-transcending truth claim. It's context-transcending in the sense that it claims a validity that is not confined to the inhabitants of particular historical contexts, but extends to everyone, everywhere. This truth claim has two components. The first component is the postulated truth of some higher end, freedom, justice, happiness, whatever. The second component is the claim that a particular socio-economic system, for instance capitalism, is detrimental to the well-being of each of its inhabitants in the sense that it prevents them from attaining that higher end, say, freedom. This holds no matter what place they occupy in the social system in question. Thus, consciousness is false both because it fails to grasp the truth of the postulated higher end. This may be a matter of failing to recognize it as a higher end, or maybe a matter of an inadequate interpretation of the higher end. But it's also false because it fails to see how the socio-economic system of which it is part prevents anyone from achieving that higher end. Importantly, however, ideology critique objects not only to the falseness of the consciousness in question, it also objects to the way in which it is produced and reproduced. It holds that the production and reproduction of false consciousness is concealed or hidden, and that this is detrimental to attaining the postulated higher end. Most accounts of ideology agree on these 2 points: that ideological consciousness is false, and that the production and reproduction of false consciousness is concealed. Some accounts of ideology, in addition, see the production and reproduction of ideologies as having another additional feature. In addition to their hidden character, they are held to serve particular interests at the expense of the interests of everyone. And I agree this looks like a typical feature of ideologies. However, I am reluctant to incorporate it into my account of ideology, since the context-transcending truth claim that I attribute to ideology critique, together with the systemic character, which, as we shortly see, I'm going to attribute to the production and reproduction of ideologies, this means, taken together, that ideologies in fact serve nobody's interests. They merely serve what are falsely perceived as the interests of some. Instead, I'd like to add a different feature to the mix. So it's not the serving a particular interest that I want to emphasize. I want to say that in addition to the two features I mentioned earlier, the context transcending truth claim and the falseness, the concealed or hidden character of ideologies, ideological thought forms serve to produce and reproduce a socio-economic system they serve to produce and reproduce a socio-economic system that is normatively inadequate along the lines I just indicated. As Adorno put it, and Simon reminded us that Marx has already said it, so Adorno is really paraphrasing Marx. Adorno puts it like this: ideology is objectively necessary, yet false consciousness. And by objectively necessary, I understand Adorno to be saying systemically necessary. So necessary for the purposes of reproducing a particular system. And this seems to me correct. But unlike Adorno, who remains bound, and probably Marx, who remains bound to a subject-object model of intentional agency, I follow Habermas in viewing the reproduction of social systems as to some extent functionalist, as having a certain independence of the intentionality of particular individuals and groups. This relative independence of personal intentionality is not just a feature of ideological thought forms. According to Habermas, who famously draws on Luhmann and Parsons, functionalist rationality is characteristic of the economic and bureaucratic systems of late modernity. Although Habermas in fact argues that the concept of ideology is inappropriate in the context of the functional systems of late capitalism, that's a different question, his concept of functionalist rationality is nonetheless helpful, I think, to our discussion of ideology. It enables us to see that in the contemporary world, at least, the transmission of ideologies may be systemic and thus not adequately described solely in terms of the intentional actions of particular individuals and groups. I've said that ideologies produce and reproduce a false consciousness. I suggested, moreover, that such production and reproduction of false consciousness is typically systemic, having some independence of the intentionality of particular individuals and groups. Taken together, these two features help to clarify what ideologies serve to hide or conceal. What is hidden is not, as some theories of ideology suggest, their furthering of particular interests, but rather their hindering of everyone's interests through contributing to the production and reproduction of a socio-economic system that is deficient from the point of view of some postulated higher end, like freedom. Other important features of ideologies, which I merely mention here, are their habitualizing and naturalizing functions, their anchoring in subjective needs, interests, and desires. Ideologies are forms of false consciousness that are manifested in embodied habits and dispositions, in sedimented patterns of behaviour, and in habitualized social practices. Furthermore, the false consciousness in question satisfies some deep-seated need, desire, or interest on the part of the human subjects concerned. The systemic, or if you like, functionalist character of ideologies, when combined with their hidden nature, their sedimentation in social practices and patterns of behaviour, and their anchoring in subjective need, interest, or desire, complicates the theorist's attempt to expose them and criticise them as such. The social critic's endeavour to convince her addressees that some of their most cherished, the most deeply held beliefs serve to produce and reproduce a socio-economic system that is hostile to everyone's well-being is likely to meet with resistance on both a rational and an affective level. Since her addressees' reason, the critic's addressees' reason and affect are contaminated by the socio-economic system they inhabit, her addressees are prevented from responding imaginatively, rationally, and emotionally to the theorist's diagnosis of what is wrong with their current situation. Such contamination may also be described in a phrase I used earlier, as a petrification of the ethical imagination. We could say that theorists' addressees are locked into closed and rigid ways of thinking and feeling in relation to the higher ends of life, such as freedom or justice. In consequence, the social critic will have to develop strategies for bringing about affectively anchored cognitive shifts in her addressees that would enable her arguments to find purchase in their subjectivities. Put slightly differently, the petrification of imagination, reason, and affect calls for modes of critique that are disclosing. By disclosing critique, I mean critique that opens our eyes to better ways of seeing ourselves in our interrelationships with others in the world, whereby better is understood in a truth-related epistemic sense. Disclosing, as I'm using it, is thus shorthand for truth disclosing. As will shortly become clear, the disclosing function of critical theory makes it particularly vulnerable to the accusation of authoritarianism. This is why it is crucial to adopt a model of theorizing that reduces the risk of authoritarianism. If we do so, I contend, the disclosing component of theorizing comes to be seen in a more innocuous light. It is then seen simply as a radicalization of the concern to avoid dogmatism and naivety, arising in context, maybe ideology, arising in contexts in which imagination, reason, and affect have become petrified. The petrification might be the result of the systemic requirements of the socio-economic context under investigation, but we can leave this question open. For the importance of disclosure in critical social theorizing does not depend on commitment to ideology critique, though ideology critique, I think that's what I've been saying, calls on theory to assume functions of disclosure, but not every theory has to engage in ideology critique. So, ideology, maybe a last word for the moment on ideology critique. Ideology critique also calls for alertness on the part of the social critic to her own theory's possible collusion in systemically transmitted false consciousness. And for the same reason, it makes disclosure important in this regard too. The systemic character of ideologies, together with their hidden nature, sedimentation in habitualized social practices, patterns of behavior, their anchoring in subjective need, interest, and desire, mean that on their own, self-reflexivity and imagination are not enough to guard against the danger that criticism too has been incorporated into the very ideological system it criticizes. One of the valuable contributions of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno's book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, one of its valuable contributions is to make us aware that reason and imagination may themselves have become vehicles for the production and reproduction of ideology, of false consciousness. Nor does commitment to some higher end, such as freedom or justice, protect a theory against becoming ideological, at least not on its own. The false consciousness required to perpetuate a socio-economic system that is hostile to the genuine well-being of its inhabitants typically includes allegiance to ethical ideas such as freedom, happiness, and justice, albeit to limited, rigid, or naive interpretations of them. Max Horkheimer makes a similar point in a short article written in the early 1930s called Notes on Science and the Crisis. Horkheimer's remarks are relevant to our discussion because they help to clarify what is required to rescue theory from naivety and dogmatism, and if the systemic aspect is taken seriously, also from ideology. And his remarks also alert us to the dangers of authoritarianism. Horkheimer held that pragmatist theories, for instance, the democratic or educational theories of John Dewey, were naive. Horkheimer actually uses the word ideological, but in a sense of ideology that lacks the systemic aspect that I think Adorno later gives it. They are, as I would put it, naive. Pragmatist theories are naive, or as he puts it, ideological, because they test the truth of a judgment according to its importance for human life. Rejecting pragmatist approaches to social critique, Horkheimer insists that it is not for social interests to decide what is true or false, but rather a theory that is capable of grasping the totality of the socio-economic system in question. Indeed, in his view, this is the prerequisite for avoiding ideology. What saves critical social theorizing from becoming ideological is not its correct grasp of the totality simpliciter, This is merely one component of the context transcending truth claim necessary for ideology critique. Rather, what is necessary is its correct grasp of the totality, coupled with the second component of the truth claim, the claim to the truth of some postulated higher end. In Horkheimer's case, the claim is that the freedom of each human being, defined in terms of creative productive activity, is of intrinsic value for everyone. Since in his view, the capitalist economy prevents human beings from attaining such freedom, the socio-economic system to which it gives rise is a form of slavery. So how is this claim to be validated? From Horkheimer's critical remarks on pragmatism, we can infer that it cannot be validated, the claim that the capitalist system basically amounts to a form of slavery. How can we validate that claim? If we take seriously his critical remarks on pragmatism, we can infer that it cannot be validated to appeal to what's important for human life, where this is defined in terms of social interests. Rather, it can be validated only theoretically, whereby, of course, the theory must be the right one. More precisely, only a theory with the correct grasp of the totality, coupled with a correct view of what constitutes human freedom, can validate the claim. From his critical remarks on the development of the applied and natural sciences, as well as on the philosophical anthropologies of the 1920s, it's obvious that Horkheimer means a theory that correctly identifies the determining role of the capitalist system of production within the socio-economic whole. In other words, his own, still relatively orthodox version, a Marxist version of critical social theory. And as I've mentioned repeatedly, this theory must be guided by the correct higher end, in other words, by Horkheimer's Marxist account of freedom as creative productive activity. In sum, in Horkheimer's account, critical social theory escapes ideology by virtue of a context-transcending truth claim, the validity of which is not made dependent on social interests, on prevailing conceptions of what is important for human life, but rather on the theory's insights into the nature of capitalism and its impact on human beings, together with its particular vision of what constitutes human flourishing. The difficulty is that its escape from ideology is bought at the risk of authoritarianism. For knowledge of the truth of its claims demands superior insight that is not generally available. Such authoritarian tendencies become increasingly evident in Horkheimer's critical theory as it develops. Thus, in his seminal essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, published a few years later in 1936, Horkheimer writes, and this is a long quote, it's my only long quote, I think, only quote in fact, but bear with me because both parts of it are important. In this essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, 1936, Horkheimer writes, I quote, "The transmission of critical theory will not take place via solidly established practice and fixed ways of acting, but rather via concern for social transformation. Such a concern will necessarily be aroused ever anew by prevailing injustice, but it must be shaped and guided by the theory itself and in turn react upon the theory." Then he goes on to say, "A version of the theory," in other words, critical social theory, of any critical theory, of any social theory, a version of the theory that has the propaganda apparatus and a majority on its side is not therefore the better one. In the general upheaval, the truth may reside with numerically small groups of men. History teaches us that such groups, hardly noticed even by those opposed to the status quo, may at the decisive moment become the leaders because of their deeper insight." End of quote. Horkheimer's statement that the truth may reside with small groups of men who may become leaders because of their deeper insight is likely to make many of us feel uncomfortable. There is an evident risk of authoritarianism. At the same time, the preceding lines in the passage help to allay fears of such authoritarianism. In these lines, as we heard, he seems to be calling for a dynamic interrelationship between, on the one side, the concern for social transformation provoked by the prevailing injustice, and on the other, critical theory as a source of the deeper insight of small groups of men. This suggests what we might call, this dynamic interrelationship suggests what we might call a feedback loop model of theorizing. In this picture of theorizing, critical theory makes the validity of its insights dependent on actual experiences of social injustice and on engagement in social transformation, while at the same time enabling the correct interpretation of these experiences and this engagement by recasting them within the narrative of its own vision of freedom. This feedback loop model entails that critical social theories' diagnoses of false consciousness are always open to challenge based on actual experiences of injustice, oppression, or suffering, and indeed also on positive experiences or unsettling ones. This means, in turn, that its diagnoses of false consciousness are not authoritarian pronouncements of truth, which must simply be accepted as such by the theory's addressees. Rather, the theory's pronouncements or statements are claims to validity that can in principle be contested rationally by everyone. And I have to say that argumentation, rational contestation, is a crucial component of the feedback loop model, but I'm not going to be able to consider that aspect of it here. For the same reason, this feedback loop model also helps to guard against dogmatism and naivety, since it fosters self-reflexivity on the part of the theory. However, going beyond Horkheimer, I hold that it's important to distinguish between two versions of the feedback loop model. Mind you, that feedback loop model is only implicit in his remarks. He doesn't use that term, I'm just extrapolating it. But I say that even then, it's important to distinguish between two versions. A basic one, which I see as inadequate for the purposes of combating dogmatism, naivety, and ideology, and an enhanced version, which is better equipped for these purposes. And the salient feature of the enhanced model that I'm going to propose, or I'm proposing, is its context-transcending, truth-disclosing components. I make truth disclosure part of the feedback loop model in two ways. First, the theory itself must be truth-disclosing, in the sense we must attribute it to it the power to bring about affectively based cognitive shifts that open our eyes to alternative, epistemically better ways of seeing ourselves in our interrelationships with others in the world. This implies, however, that experiences too make claims to validity, to truth in a context-transcending sense. We must attribute to experiences too, or more precisely, I think, to the arguments based on experiences, a putative truth-disclosing power. Their truth-disclosing power makes experiences, as I would put it, epistemically significant, but not epistemically reliable, and that's why we need arguments. For, as we have seen, experiences are in general epistemically unreliable, be this due to ideological contamination, due to the petrification of reason and affect, or simply because experiences can only be interpreted linguistically, and linguistic interpretation is contingent on history, context, subjective psychology. In short, experiences, I would want to say, have a truth power, but they do not guarantee us access to truth. My enhanced version of the feedback loop model, with its intertwined truth-disclosing components, not only avoids naivety, it keeps the anti-authoritarian and anti-dogmatic impulses of critical social theory in productive tension with its long-standing commitment to ideology critique. For this reason, I regard it as the most suitable model. But this view does not appear to be shared by some prominent contemporary critical social theorists. So in my last part of my presentation, I'm going to illustrate what I mean. By reference to a recent book by Axel Honneth, which some of you will know, called Das Recht der Freiheit, Freedom's Right. It came out in German in 2011, English in 2013. In his book, Freedom's Right, Axel Honneth has recently offered a critique of the capitalist market that lacks the truth-disclosing elements built into my enhanced feedback loop model of theory. And recall that I've argued that these truth-disclosing components are necessary in order to avoid dogmatism, naivety, and ideology. So, by dispensing with the truth-disclosing components of the feedback loop model, Honneth opens his critique of capitalism to the objection of dogmatism in particular, I think, but also it opens his critique of capitalism to the objection that it serves to reproduce a certain ideology. And I want to try and show this now. A central part of Honneth's book, Freedom's Right, is devoted to a normative reconstruction of the potentials for individual freedom contained within what he sees as one of the key institutions of Western modernity, the capitalist market. In his lead up to his discussion of the market, he argues for a particular way of conceptualizing individual freedom. By way of a critical discussion of two prominent alternative conceptions of freedom, what he calls negative and moral freedom, Honneth takes some preliminary steps towards showing the superiority of a Hegelian view of individual freedom as social freedom. Social freedom, as he describes it, is the form of freedom that's given when we encounter each other in mutual recognition, where each can understand her own actions as the condition for the fulfillment of the other's aims. It's a version of Hegel's famous dictum, freedom is being by oneself in another. That's social freedom for Honneth. Honneth's provocative thesis is that the capitalist market is a potential site of social freedom. It's an institutional complex where individuals recognize each other's free activities as conditions for the realization of their own aims. It's important to understand that Honneth's claim is not simply that the capitalist market could, under the right social and political conditions, enable individual freedom in the sense of social freedom. Rather, he's making the strong claim that a potential for social freedom is built into the very concept of the capitalist market. In other words, for Honneth, his argument is the capitalist market engenders individual freedom in the sense of social freedom. And that's the premise of his critical discussion. Starting from this premise, Honneth tells the story of what he describes as the capitalist market's misdevelopment over the past 200 years, ending with the sobering situation, he puts it, in which we now find ourselves. The story he tells is one of conflict between two views of the market, based on two opposing views of individual freedom. The one view grasps the capitalist market in terms of individual advantage, and the other grasps it in terms of the mutual satisfaction of interests. In the one case, freedom is absence of constraint on self-interested strategic action. That's the advantage model. In the other, it's a cooperative effort in which the relations of competition are in the interests of all involved. In Honneth's account, our current sobering situation, not by any means the first in the history of capitalism, is due to the predominance of the individual advantage view of the market and freedom, and individual advantage view of the market and accompanying conception of freedom in terms of the strategic pursuit of self-interest. Honneth presents his story as what he calls a normative reconstruction. As he puts it, the social critic selects certain institutions and practices out of the chaos of social reality. He then identifies the key values embodied in these institutions and practices, using the imperfect or insufficient realization of the identified values as a means of criticizing the institutions and practices in question. So in this case, Honneth picks out the institutional complex, that's the capitalist market, identifying social freedom as the value embodied within it. And he then offers an empirically based account of the market as the imperfect realization, the misdevelopment, if you like, of this value. That's why his critique is the story of the market's misdevelopment, the imperfect realization of social freedom. The capitalist market's misdevelopment is explained as the result of historically contingent failures and omissions, such as the lack of government regulation and intervention, together with absence of discursive mechanisms, as he calls it, by which he means places of negotiation and places for public discussion that could, for example, encourage consumers to examine their own needs from the point of view of their compatibility with the satisfaction of everyone's needs. His implication, evidently, is that the right kind of regulatory, interventionist and discursive mechanisms would enable the capitalist market to fulfill its potentials as a site for social freedom. It's important to see, in light of what I'm going to say very soon, it's important to see that the method of normative reconstruction always offers room for criticising social reality, in this case the capitalist market. Indeed, although Honneth himself doesn't state this explicitly, it also permits self-critique on the part of the theory. So it would be wrong to say that Honneth's reading of the capitalist market admits no challenge. To be sure, it's prejudiced from the outside in favour of social freedom, for as we've seen, his starting hypothesis is that the two are conceptually connected. Nonetheless, this starting hypothesis is open to correction through appeal to empirical evidence relating to the actual development of the capitalist markets. At least I'm taking this to be Honneth's position. Thus, we can attribute to Honneth the basic version of what I've called the feedback loop model of validation. So why then do I find his approach deficient? Or why do I find the basic feedback loop model deficient? Because I think he has the basic feedback loop model. More specifically, why do I think it's vulnerable to the accusation of dogmatism and holds that it's perhaps also ideological? My answer, first, is that it's a closed feedback loop. There is no outside to the loop that could shine a light on the truth or falsity of the premise from which the theory's normative reconstruction proceeds. And in this case, the normative premise, as I've said, is the conceptual connection between the capitalist market and social freedom. And the second reason why I think it's deficient is that in Honneth's critique of the market, the validity of the historical experiences to which he appeals in support of his story of capitalism's misdevelopment, the validity of the historical experiences is determined in advance by the normative premise of the story. They do not have the power to fundamentally challenge or unsettle this normative premise, although conceivably they might prompt some modification of it. To understand what I mean by this, I'm nearly finished. Is that okay? About 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. To understand what I mean by this, consider two important elements of Honneth's argumentative strategy. And up to now, I've only spoken about it as normative reconstruction in a very general way. So the two important elements in his actual critique of the market are, first, his appeal to Hegel and Durkheim, each of whom, in his view, offers normative accounts of the capitalist market that haven't been taken sufficiently seriously. The second is his identification of resistant movements to what he describes as capitalism's misdevelopment. And I'm going to say something about each of these briefly in turn. So I'm referring really just now recapping the two key elements in Honneth's normative reconstruction, his critique of capitalism. So he thinks Hegel and Durkheim have offered a story that hasn't been taken seriously. The frame for Honneth's discussion of Hegel and Durkheim is what's called the Adam Smith problem. This is the problem, not articulated by Smith himself, of how to reconcile his economic thought with his moral philosophy. As Honneth puts it, Adam Smith bequeathed the critique of capitalism with the question of whether the promise of freedom inherent in the modern market economy should be conceived of in terms of strategically calculating economic actors or in terms of intersubjectively related partners in communication. Honneth presents Hegel's and Durkheim's critiques of the capitalist market as responses to this question that favour the intersubjective communication answer. To begin with, he highlights both authors' insistence on the non-market ethical norms and values on which the operation of the capitalist market depends, for instance, mutual respect and trust. In addition, he draws attention to the claim that the capitalist market engenders the sense of a cooperative community of consumers and producers. It engenders a sense of solidarity that makes it a potential site for social freedom. While the dependency of market capitalism, I would say, on non-market ethical norms and values seems uncontroversial, the claim that the capitalist market engenders a sense of solidarity is highly debatable. Hegel's and Durkheim's arguments in support of this claim seem very thin, even on the generous reading Honneth gives to them. Moreover, even in Honneth's story, the writings of Hegel and Durkheim are marked by ambivalence concerning the market's capacity to engender solidarity. As he presents their views on the capitalist market, Hegel and Durkheim seem aware of the precariousness of their reading of it in terms of intersubjective relations of communication. For instance, as Honneth himself acknowledges, Hegel is remarkably prescient regarding the likelihood of manipulation of consumer needs for economic profit, and Durkheim is clear-eyed about the ways in which the mechanisation of labour in the interests of economic profit results in a loss of skill and initiative that prevents workers from seeing themselves as making a valuable contribution to social cooperation. However, while he makes no attempt to conceal this ambivalence, Honneth seems not to see it as reason for doubt as to the market's inherent capacity to engender feelings of solidarity. At most, he sees it as a reason for continued efforts to develop and promote its capacity for solidarity in the face of such obstacles as may contingently arise. And I think this is the first indication that his theory is dogmatic, for it seems simply to assert the market's capacity to engender a sense of a cooperative community of consumers and producers, overlooking the thinness of Hegel's and Durkheim's arguments in this regard, and also disregarding their own apparent awareness of the precariousness of their positions. A second indication of dogmatism can be found in his discussion of resistance movements within capitalism. Honneth supplements his reading of Hegel and Durkheim with an account of resistance movements to capitalism that, in his view, take seriously the normative promises of the capitalist market. However, in this regard too, I find his discussion dogmatic. In some cases, admittedly, the resistance movements mentioned do seem to take seriously the normative promise of the capitalist market. What is not evident, however, is that they see it as the promise of social freedom, as opposed to the promise of freedom to pursue one's individual advantage. For example, Honneth refers to 19th century demands for the right to work as evidence. He refers to 19th century demands for the right to work as evidence of a concern for social freedom, on the grounds that such demands appeal to the dignity and honour of the common man. However, he fails to show convincingly that these demands for work should be read in this way, and at least in the absence of a richer historical account and more rigorous analysis, the demands should be read equally plausible in terms of the freedom to pursue one's individual advantage. So there are other, I think I'm going on too long, so he gives other examples of resistance movements, but in each case I think he doesn't really show that they're examples of resistance movements that take seriously the promise of capitalism as a site for social freedom. But my main point is, so I can skip over a little bit here, because my main point is that even if Honneth's readings of the historical evidence were less tendentious, and even if his discussion of Hegel and Durkheim was more nuanced, and even if he had dealt more extensively with the theoretical literature as opposed to just focusing on two theorists, the very method of normative reconstruction makes his critique of capitalism vulnerable to the objection of dogmatism. I think in other cases perhaps to naivety, but in his case I think it's dogmatism that is the worry. While, as we saw earlier, this method allows not just for critique of social reality, but also for self-critique on the part of critical social theory, self-critique is reduced to a matter of adjusting and correcting the theory's normative premise in light of its own readings of selected empirical evidence and of selected other theorists. Thus, no matter how nuanced or how extensive his reading of the theoretical literature, no matter how rich and how fine-grained his historical analyses of resistance movements, Honneth's critique of capitalism cannot avoid dogmatism, since it discounts from the outset the validity of any normative perspective that diverges fundamentally from his own. And this is the result of his purely immanent strategies, which extract standards for critique solely from the theorist's reading of the social institutions and practices that are the object of critique. In the terminology used earlier, the accuracy of these readings may be called into question, but alternative readings would never suffice to challenge the truth of the premise from which the theorist starts. And this is because the truth of the premise derives from these readings, which in turn only have validity only in terms of the premise. And this allows for an endless process of mutual adjustment between the normative premise and the theorist's readings of empirical reality and of other theorists. But it does not allow for the possibility that arguments based on experiences in reality, or indeed arguments based on alternative readings of other theorists, might challenge the validity of the normative premise itself. And that's what I meant when I earlier referred to a closed feedback loop model of theorizing. Put differently, Honnett's feedback loop model, being closed or basic, as I said also earlier, it leaves no room for disclosures of truth, in which arguments based on experiences in the world open the theorist's eyes to alternative, epistemically better ways of looking at the world, fundamentally unsettling his conceptual framework. Nor does it allow for disclosures of truth in which the theorist's readings of experience in reality cast these experiences in an unfamiliar light, opening her addressee's eyes to alternative, epistemically better ways of looking at the world, fundamentally unsettling their conceptual frameworks. In short, Honnett's purely immanent strategy lacks the disclosing elements of the enhanced version of the feedback loop model I propose. Honnett is not alone in rejecting disclosure of truth as an important part of validation. His purely immanent method, which disallows context-transcending validity claims, either from the side of experience or from the side of theory, fits very well with current trends in normative political and social theorizing. And I'm thinking here in particular of the new, so-called new realists in political theory, who share in common an objection to theoretical approaches that make context-transcending claims to validity. Thinking, for example, of Raymond Geuss or Bernard Williams, who are quite different, but they share a hostility to context-transcending truth claims. Despite significant differences among these theorists and between the new realists and Honneth, they are united by hostility to a perceived overinflation of the power of theory, and they advocate a more modest self-understanding. While these new realists and Honneth might, at a push, accept the shaping and guiding roles I ascribe to theory, the real stumbling block is the additional truth-disclosing role it takes on in the enhanced feedback loop model I'm proposing. Although they do not say so outright, I suspect that the immodest theories they find distasteful are ones in which appeal to truth is an indispensable component. There's no shortage of evidence that contemporary theory is deeply suspicious of claims to validity in a context-transcending sense. So why are they so suspicious? As I see it, the worry is not in the first instance the worry I voiced about epistemological authoritarianism. I think that's a genuine worry. I think that's the real worry. To many, but that's not the worry, I think, that's driving contemporary hostility to context-transcending validity. Their worry is... I think to many, the yearning for truth, for the unconditioned and absolute, I'm quoting Richard Rorty here, that kind of yearning for truth is both unhealthy and immature. And the implication is that in a more wholesome, mature theoretical environment, appeals to truth will play no role. However, as my very brief discussion of Honnett's critique of capitalism sought to show, dispensing with truth disclosure makes theories vulnerable to dogmatism and in other cases to naivety. It also rules out the possibility of ideology critique. So, I could say more about why ideology critique is a good thing, but I do want to close by saying that if you do weigh for ideology critique, you need some kind of context transcending truth claims. So what I have tried to do by way of proposing what I've called an enhanced feedback loop model of social and political theorizing is to allow for a mode of theorizing that asserts a context-transcending truth claims without succumbing to authoritarianism. So it's able to be both anti-authoritarian, and has the ability at least to engage in ideology critique by virtue of its context-transcending truth claim, and by virtue of the same claims to be radically reflexive, anti-dogmatic, and anti-naive. So there are other things I can say about this, but I apologise for speaking so long, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
You on a really interesting lecture. I just have a short question. So I'm interested, how is this feedback loop model different from Pragmatist Theory of Truth, especially a special reading of Pragmatist Theory of Truth? For instance, Dewey was writing on common sense and science, their respective field of interest or something like that in 1928. And where he explicitly says that the point of science is to put together relatively far away parts of experience, and in that sense, that should be the enhanced model, or it's I don't know whether it's compatible with your model. So perhaps Rortian reading of pragmatism is not compatible, but some other modification of that reading should be. So that's it.
Well, I'm very grateful for the question, and I think you've put it, you've anticipated my response and put it better than I probably could have. My response actually is I don't know, but I'm very sympathetic to the possibility that a different reading of Dewey, certainly to Horkheimer's and also to Rorty's, who's hostile to truth, would enable me to position or to use Dewey, in fact, as an illustration of the enhanced feedback loop model. I'd be willing to be guided by you here, because I don't really, I'm not confident enough in my own reading of Dewey. I mean, that's where I'm going after this, because it seems to me to say whether or not that is the case. Part of me wonders about the how far Dewey would be willing to go with transcendence, if you like. I don't know. I mean, certainly he says enough about the experience of art, for instance, that make me think he might be a very good resource for the model I'm using. But all I can say is thank you. I'm perfectly willing to accept that Dewey is an exemplar of the enhanced feedback loop model, but it's not something I can say confidently yet.
There's also in Human Nature and Conduct, he says like something like that. The main idea is to attain this kind of reflexive habit, which is not petrified, it's also correlated.
I mean, one just thing of that. I don't know if Dewey has this, but what is certainly, and I'd said nothing about this here. In order to go in this direction of the enhanced feedback loop model, even if truth is thought of in this model, truth is always mediated, so I feel like it's a postmodern version. But nonetheless, one has to conceptualize truth. So one actually has to work out the details of what truth is in this account. So that's why I want to really try and find in Dewey what his conceptualization of truth actually looks like. And I haven't found it in any of the critical theorists actually yet either. So that's an ongoing project for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. I would like to comment a little on your reading of Horkheimer. It was not at the very core of your presentation, but somewhat at the core. And I feel like I should come a little to the defense of Horkheimer, though I'm myself highly critical about him. But what I think, I mean, you're completely right. The issue of truth and truth of theory is very crucial for Horkheimer from the beginning on. But the question is, how is theoretical truth established for Horkheimer? And in this sense, I'm truly convinced that he's much more in a, I would say, historical materialist paradigm than you portrayed it, because for him, as far as I grasp him, theory is nil and void, critical theory, if it loses the relation to history and historical movement. And this relation, I mean, Horkheimer conceives it as very precarious. He's very well aware that the communist parties and the proletariat, they do not establish this relation properly. But without this relation, it's nil and void. And this is where your argument enters. But what I think, how Horkheimer constructs it, it's for him, Judaism is very much important. And I mean, the small groups of men, these are the Jewish people. I mean, he has a very romantic image of Jewish people. It's another story. But what he sees also, what is important, Judaism, it's empty. at its core, it's empty. It represents another in existing society. We don't know what this another is, but it's there. And the Jews, they are orthodox. They pray, they keep their faith, but their faith for Horkheimer, it's only rules. It's an orthodoxy. In this view, it's also very dogmatic. And by this, a critical theory gains a validity because everyone is free to join. I mean, not the Jews as a religion, but this idea. And as long as this relation exists, truth can be established in a historical materialist way. And I think this has to be regarded when judging Horkheimer on truth as well. It's not completely contradicting what you're saying, rather complementary, but I think we need to be fair with Horkheimer. That's it.
Well, that's very interesting, and thank you. I'm pausing here because I find it really interesting that the small groups of men are Jewish, specifically as opposed to Marxist Jewish, but Jewish, and that prayer is involved. But I have to think more about that. It makes sense to me, but I have to think more about it, and it's illuminating actually. But just to be clear, I'm not actually criticising Horkheimer because I think that's why I read out the whole quote, because I think just what you say, theory has to be. The first part of the quote makes very clear: theory has to be nourished by actual concern for injustice and for social transformation. And only at the end of the paragraph, for good reason, he warns against a naive appeal to experience or to concern for social transformation because of the propaganda machine and so on. But I think the quotation, I was really just using it. Even if one could not only understand but even think Horkheimer's statement was justified in the historical circumstances, it does alert us to the danger of authoritarianism, which any theory, and I think especially a theory that any theory that cuts itself off from argumentative challenge and the experiences underlying those arguments, I think, runs the risk of authoritarianism. I'm not saying his theories are authoritarian. I'm just saying it's vulnerable to it, and he has to. Theories have to work against it. Critical theories have to do both. So that's this productive tension. They have to make those strong claims, but they have to work against it. And that's the feedback loop. But thank you.
Okay, I have a question regarding the kind of feedback loop model of theorizing. As it seems to me, the dangers of petrification of thought, they're two-dimensional in the feedback loop model. On the one hand, they come from authoritarianism, from the direction of theorizing totality. Yeah. On the other hand, they come from naivety or from taking all the actors' perspectives at face value. So I was wondering, when you were mentioning Horkheimer's critique of pragmatism, maybe we should take this. So Horkheimer's view of the pragmatist theory of truth is that a statement, the truth value of a statement can be judged according to whether it is conducive to human life. That's how he defined it. Human life here taken at face value, also without taking account of domination and how it is kind of how it permeates human life. But what I was wondering is, Horkheimer's account of the pragmatist theory of truth is evidently, I would say, incomplete here, because what I had in mind is Nancy Fraser, for example. She, for me, is a good example of how critical theory can be grounded within a non-authoritarian epistemology, because what she says basically is a truth claim of a theoretical statement or a critical theoretical statement can be judged according to not whether it is conducive to human life, but whether it offers us better means to cope with domination. And domination is here conceived in procedural terms, so terms which can be universally valid without implying a vision of a totality of the social order, meaning procedural justice, parity of participation, and so forth. So I was wondering whether one way to escape this, in my view, inevitable petrification that comes from both authoritarianism and naivety is actually in proceduralizing the normative criteria of critique on the one hand, and then applying a pragmatist theory of truth in judging theoretical statements, and whether Fraser is a good example of also feedback loop theory.
Well, thank you. The answer, the answer is complex. In some ways not. I would say that I don't see it as, I don't see, say, the Fraser path, proceduralist path, as addressing the questions I'm concerned with, because whatever, I mean, in her debate with Axel Honneth, for instance, we have a kind of a standoff between two normative ideas of, if you like, the good society or human well-being. One is a proceduralist idea, formulation in terms of parity of, it's not a parity of esteem, it's a parity of participation. And the other is, Honneth is in terms of recognition. So I don't think you can. The question is, how do you evaluate each theorist, Honneth and Fraser, are making claims about what should be our guiding normative principle when we're identifying what's wrong as theorists, as critics with social life, and as we're making our projections as to how to move forward. Nancy Fraser as much as Honneth. Just because it's proceduralist doesn't mean it doesn't have any content. Why should we single out parity of participation as the higher end, if you like, of the kind of in the kind of societies we're aiming for? Exactly the same can be said of Honneth. Honneth tries to tell us an anthropological and psychoanalytic story of why recognition is important. Fraser doesn't even do that. But my point would be that, irrespective, I actually don't think. I think it's perfectly in order for Honneth or Fraser to hold out to us a vision of, say, parity of participation on the one hand, or tripartite model of mutual recognition on the other, hold it out conflicting to a certain extent visions, and then to open them up to contestation and debate. But in each case, the theorist is always, like every theorist, is open to the accusation of being insufficiently self-reflexive if they don't allow for the possibility, let's say, that parity of participation is not, in fact, the normative aim we should be aspiring towards. I mean, just because it's procedural doesn't make it any less controversial. It's still a model.
This reflexivity built into the principle itself. As she says, it's a historically evolving principle. So there is a move back towards the actors themselves in grounding normative.
Sure, but I mean, Axel Honneth's model is also self-reflexive, but that's not enough. It only can correct itself in terms of its own starting premise. So if the premise is whatever happens, parity of participation is the key, I'm simplifying here, is the key normative idea, then of course what that means, you as a critic, you're open to the ways in which that normative idea is interpreted in changing historical circumstances, and there's lots of reflexivity in the model. But the question is, at what point could the process of history make us really move away from the idea of parity of participation as a normative idea? That's what I'm saying. It's not an objection to her normative idea. It's an objection to any method that doesn't fundamentally acknowledge the need to convince people of its very normative presence, as opposed to just hand waving towards history or the democratic institutional complex of modernity or whatever.
Yes, sir.
Okay. My question is, I wonder. Okay, thank you. I wonder how this enhanced loop model, feedback loop model, would work. A little bit, if you could tell me tell us with a little bit more detail, because I'm thinking about the question, a problematic aspect of Axel Honneth's theory on freedom's right, and problematic because challenging is the coupling between normative theory and social research. And I was wondering here, because when you make normative claims, it needs some assertiveness, you know, and it makes sense when you read Honneth talking about social freedom. For me, it makes sense. But when you go to the empirical part, then it seems that because social research, on the other hand, seems to require some holding back. If you think about the project of Boltanski and Thévenot, okay, they're mapping social values, but when it comes to selecting which of these values we as normative theorists should say, oh, this is the fulfillment of human life and so on. So how to balance, this seems to be a very difficult project in terms of balancing the assertiveness of normative theory and the requirements of social research. It seems that some authoritarian or element is always present in some sense. I don't know.
I mean, I think that is the really difficult challenge. So I mean, what I'm saying is really is not very dramatic, let's say. It's really just with regard to your specific question. So the problem with the sort of general problem with Honneth's approach, which is really particularly evident in his account of the market, but I think it's also evident in what he has to say about the democratic public sphere, or possibly also in the family. I haven't looked at that in such close detail, is that he picks key institutions. He thinks he can get away with the problem of normative justification because he can point to institutions that are actually out there in our lives and have become part of our history, and say, well, we have to just look and see what potentials they contain for freedom, for a better kind of life. Now, I don't have problems with that I actually think it's a wonderful way of approaching social reality. There's two difficulties with Honneth. One is Hegel could do what Honneth did because he had Geist, he had spirit in the background. But if you do away with the idea that history has some kind of teleology, or that these institutions have some objectively better, status quality than the institutions that went before them, then you really do have to address the question of why should we think of the market as, in any way, as a site for freedom. Now, it could be. I'm willing to engage with Honneth on this, so I don't think he's wrong to say it might be, but to say it is from the beginning is really just prejudicing the inquiry. So I think that's the problem is not so much the selectivity of the reading, because every critic is going to read social reality selectively. So I would just say, be upfront about it. The social critic should be as attentive as possible to empirical and historical reality, past and present. Recognise self-reflexively that her readings are interpretations and they're selective. It doesn't make them not valuable as readings, because readings are always can be illumination. I would say they have a truth component. They can really make us see things a different way. But we have to, as theorists, we have to argue our case for our readings and say, and when people say, well, you left out this part of the story, or you left out these other resistance movements, then we maybe have to modify our readings, and we always have to be prepared to give up our normative premise. So, I would say everything Honneth does is fine once he's willing to say at the end, well, perhaps the market doesn't have any inherent capacity for freedom, but it was worthwhile trying to see if it did. So it's just really I mean, that's, so I think it's an important modification, my position, the enhanced feedback loop model, but I think it's a slight but important modification, small but important.